I said I've never seen such idiots in all my life.
Listen to all this, eh?
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
What do you get when you mix a hot-tempered woman, a bread knife, her boyfriend's leg, and one gynocentric judge? A suspended sentence, of course. For the past few weeks, we've been discussing the accountability gap, a gender disparity in the degree to which people are held accountable for the impact of their choices on themselves and on others. This gap both influences and is influenced by the way our gynocentric society subordinates men's interests and even their welfare to women's interests. That results in egregious double standards and inhuman treatment of men. We've already described how this has resulted in false beliefs such as the wage gap myth. We've gone over how it has led to discriminatory law and policy, as is seen in family law, where its effect is unchecked, even to the detriment of children. We've discussed its impact on sexual conduct standards and their impact on law and policy. Today, we're going a little further along that train of thought to discuss the gender disparity in accountability for criminal acts. Jill K. Dorner, in her 2009 doctoral thesis, and Sonia B. Starr, in a 2012 paper published in the University of Michigan Law School Law and Economics Research Paper Series, both noted unexplained gender gaps in outcomes in federal criminal cases. Both papers described variations in the scope of outcome disparity depending on ethnicity, legal factors, and type of offense committed, but none of these factors completely eliminated the gender gap. For instance, Dorner pointed out, in her 2009 report explaining the gender gap in sentencing outcomes and investigation of differential treatment in U.S. federal courts, that prior research had found greater racial disparities in sentencing in drug crimes, on average, than women do. Women are also significantly likelier to avoid charges and convictions, and twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted. There are large unexplained gaps across the sentence distribution, and across a wide variety of specifications, subsamples, and estimation strategies. The data cannot disentangle all possible causes of these gaps, but they do suggest that certain factors, such as child care and offense rolls, are partial but not complete explanations, even combined. Both women noted that the most prevalent beliefs about the reasons for this disparity were not supported by evidence, but instead involved theoretical arguments. In other words, they were rooted in existing biases. For instance, some attempt to explain the gap by pointing to women charged as accessories to crimes committed by men, but Starr noted that such cases do not account for a significant portion of the gap, and they do not explain crimes committed individually by women. She even found that the same factors can influence judges in different directions depending on the sex of the defendant. For instance, being a parent would gain a female defendant some leniency, but according to Starr's report, among single men, conditional on observables, having children significantly increases sentences, and among married men, children make no significant difference. So, differing factors related to crimes and their perpetrators are not the main causes of the gender gap in criminal sentencing. What are they then? One clue to this is in Starr's explanation for differences between her study and studies showing a narrower gap. She wrote in her report that previous studies may not have shown such a sharp difference because they had not looked at the role of plea bargains and other pre-sentencing steps in the criminal justice system. The difference this makes is in the role of prosecutorial influence. She wrote, "The United States in effect has a system of negotiated justice, and prosecutors hold most of the chips. They have broad discretion to choose charges from numerous overlapping criminal statutes, and then to determine the terms of plea deals. Plea bargaining does not necessarily focus mainly on dropping of charges. Indeed, the lead charge was dropped only 17% of the time in this study's sample. The parties also negotiate stipulations to key sentencing facts, for instance, the quantity of drugs trafficked or the defendant's major or minor role in a conspiracy. The prosecutor also may make non-binding sentencing recommendations or request special leniency to reward cooperators. Public relations is another area described in Starr's report, as she cited prosecutorial discretion as a potential inroad for gender bias. A prosecutor faced with a defendant who is able to effectively play victim of her own choices risks being seen as an overzealous bully going after a poor, helpless, wayward waif who didn't do nothing but get caught up in circumstances beyond her control. What a nightmare when attempting to persuade a jury to find her guilty, should the case be anything but sensational. And even more so if the case is remembered as prosecutorial bullying the next time that prosecutor is up for re-election. Starr reported findings from previous research indicating that prosecutors' choices in what charges to bring and the resulting determination of sentences sought were affected by factors such as these. One factor is not noted by either researcher, and I have not seen research on gender disparity in criminal court that did look at this. Disparity in outcomes for reported intimate partner and sex crimes is written into the law. In Western countries influenced by feminist jurisprudence, intimate partner and sexual violence law is embedded with the assumption that perpetrators are male and victims are female. In some countries, including the U.S., this is so blatant that national law itself has a gendered title. In the U.S., it's called the Violence Against Women Act. Throughout the law, gendered language is used liberally in an indication that the law's protection is reserved for female citizens and its repercussions for males. Section 40291 of the Violence Against Women Act establishes an effort to prove a pattern of specifically male violence against specifically female victims. Section 40121 establishes an effort to train law enforcement and prosecutors to look strictly for male violence against female victims. Section 40231 establishes a financial incentive for arrests, offers of state-funded legal advocacy for accusers in domestic violence cases, and funds influence of judicial handling of cases, all with female victim, male perpetrator portrayal of these crimes. The combination is specifically designed to ensure harsh treatment for men and boys accused of partner violence, while establishing leniency for accused women and girls. This has resulted in more than gender disparity in conviction and sentencing outcomes. Included in a 2011 report, The Help-Seeking Experiences of Men Who Sustain Intimate Partner Violence, an Overlooked Population and Implications for Practice, by Emily M. Douglas and Denise A. Hines, is this statement that some male victims of partner abuse report having been arrested upon seeking help from police, rather than their perpetrators being arrested. In other words, in this area, not only is there a disparity in outcomes for perpetrators, male victims of female perpetrators face potential punishment for attempting to hold their perps accountable at all. Another influence affecting the accountability gap in criminal cases is that of women's advocates. The National Organization for Women has actively promoted some of the myths surrounding gender disparity in sentencing and gender stereotyped beliefs about criminal offenders in their advocacy for leniency in female criminal cases. This is the same organization that has published lobbying agendas which included demands for increases in prosecution of men unable to keep up with child support obligations. In Now's book, a single mom who sells drugs in front of her kids deserves a break, but a non-custodial father who cannot earn enough money to support 2 households? Throw the book at him. #feminist logic. That isn't just a U.S. feminist attitude either. Guidelines handed down in the UK in 2010 admonished judges to go easier on female offenders. In 2011, a UK Women's Justice Task Force report offered the suggestion that women's prisons in the UK should be replaced with community service and mental health treatment. While the research done by the group making the suggestion is of interest, there is nothing in it to suggest that it is applicable only to women. Yet the suggestion has not been extended to apply to male offenders. This leaves us with some uncomfortable questions. Are we as a society responding to criminal offense in the most productive way we can, or are we using the criminal justice system as a vehicle for the perpetuation of our species' tribalism? If the point of the penal system is the use of punishment as an effective deterrent to crime and a containment system for the criminally incorrigible, what does that say about society's attitude toward female criminals and their victims? Are crime victims less victimized if their perpetrators are women? Are their experiences and their rights less important? Does society think women less possessed of the self-control necessary to keep their behavior within the bounds of the law? Isn't having less culpability an indication of less capability? And wouldn't that indicate justification for restricting women's freedoms, as one would those of children, in order to prevent serious life-impacting errors? I wouldn't think that would be what feminists would want to advocate for, but isn't it the logical conclusion to their gendered position on criminal sentencing? What if, as feminists argue when lobbying for alternatives to incarceration for women, such measures really are a more effective way of dealing with many criminal offenders? If that is what works, why wouldn't we want to use such alternatives with both sexes? Surely we don't want rehabilitation from women, but recidivism from men. And if, as feminists argue, harsh sentencing is a human rights issue, shouldn't the push for reforming the system be inclusive rather than gender discriminatory? After all, men are human. They're as human as women are, aren't they? Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 18, Crime and Punishment, Accountability Gap Locked In. Just a reminder, if you want to join in the chat on YouTube, please go to the Badger Livestreams channel. If YouTube is experiencing platform malfunction syndrome and won't let you listen, we're also on Twitch. And if you're into this kind of thing and you want us to go deeper, harder, and faster, consider becoming a patron at feedthebadger.com. After all, a big mouth's got to be fed, right? I'm here tonight with Woozle Slayer Karen Strawn, professor of... Every time I do this, there has to be a technical difficulty. My whole intro just closed on me again. There we go. Professor of Perspicacity, Aiden Paladin, and that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, to put another aspect of the accountability gap on lockdown. You'll all come along quietly, won't you? We wouldn't have to do this the hard way. Wouldn't want to have to do this the hard way.
Well, you know, I think this whole thing is exemplified by that pilot project that they did in California a few years back, where they actually were, they had initiated a system of early release for female offenders who were nonviolent and not at, you know, serious risk of recidivism or whatever. They looked at a number of factors, right? And they were going to be like, okay, we can actually clear up some space. We are piling people in prisons in California, stacking them cheek by jowl, Velcroing them to the walls and the ceilings to make space, right? Because we just don't have it. It is overcrowded, right? So let's let nonviolent female criminals out early. And the whole justification for this was to free up space within the prison system that is overcrowded. But it's like when 85% to 95% of your inmates are men, why wouldn't you extend this to nonviolent male convicts? Like, why would you not do that? So, and the excuses were just, well, you know, it's a pilot project, right? Oh, no, it's not. You know, it's just female favoritism, right? And it's really excruciating, because this is something that has been dealt with, you know, all through history, right? All through history. You know, initially coverture laws made it so that if a woman committed a crime, technically it would be in her husband's presence, but usually it was applied if he knew, right? If he had had reason to know, right, that she was doing this or had committed this crime, right? Then he could be prosecuted in her stead, because it was his responsibility to ensure that she obeyed the law. And then in the 1920s, in American newspapers, they were having a debate about giving a general amnesty to women who killed men, because just in opinion pieces in these newspapers, because they considered it was considered a waste of taxpayer money to even prosecute a woman. And then you have movies like Chicago, or musicals like Chicago that lay this out in absolute perfect detail, pretty much you had to kill a man because he popped his gum too loud, right? And it just annoyed you. He caught you on a day when you were in a piss mood, and you said, you're popping your gum, and I don't like it. And he just did it again, and you shot him in the head, right? And he had it coming, just like in the song. And that was about probably the only woman who would actually have been convicted. So it's essentially like, this is an ongoing problem. This is not a new problem. This is not a problem with feminism. This is just a problem with general gynocentrism and chauvinism and all of those things. And if we want to live in a society where men and women are considered equal and women are liberated, right? In order to be liberated and have all of the freedoms that men have, right? You do need to have everybody having an equal form of accountability applied to them, right? You can't have, we even see this with Hillary, and she can pull the sexism card. Do we really want a president that nobody is allowed to criticize because she can say, oh, you're only saying that because you hate women? This is a big fucking problem, right? The accountability gap, if we are going to have equal rights and freedoms for men and women. And nobody wants to look at it. Nobody wants to think about it. And certainly nobody wants to deal with it. They're in the process of trying to make things worse for the most part. So,
well, look at people getting off for the insanity plea just because they had premenstrual syndrome. Like, it's absurd, the amount of things that they want to let women off for. And so many people are like, oh, they shouldn't even be sent to prison, period. It doesn't matter what they did. It's just a waste of time. That would send the wrong idea, right?
There's a good pun there, though, by the way.
Unintentional, I assure you.
Yeah, I actually just looked that up, too, like what the numbers were on that, because I was just interested. I mean, I knew that, I was trying to see if I could figure out exactly how much we spend on women's so-called prisons compared to men's prisons and incarceration. So I did find at least that women make up about 6%, though, of inmates compared to men. And I think just based on that, we could probably, draw some conclusions about how much money is being spent on that alone. So, yeah, that's an absolute absurdity to say, oh, well, if we want to save some money, we should, let some of these... Well, it almost implies innocence. These non-violent female offenders go. They didn't do nothing, yeah. So, yeah. But no, and insane waste of time.
Well, but what strikes me too about that is that if okay, the only women who are actually ending up in prison are the really egregious cases, right? We're not, like, they are 6% of inmates. If you walk all of the numbers back and all of the discounts that women get just because of their gender, for similar crimes and similar circumstances, right? And these women get these discounts, and it's not just the 63% difference in sentencing. It's also the half as likely to even be incarcerated in the first place, and less likely to be, like when they commit a crime, they're less likely than a man to be stopped, right, by the police. They're less likely than a man to be arrested. When they're arrested, they're less likely to be charged. When they're charged, they're less likely to be prosecuted. When they're prosecuted, they're offered better plea deals, right? And also the charges against them will be generally less severe than the ones that would be levied against a man, right? If it goes to trial, they're less likely to be convicted, and they are half as likely to be sentenced to any incarceration at all. So really, we're only putting the worst of women in prison. Right. Also, and so to say that 6% of inmates who are the worst of the worst in their category should be the ones who we should have some program to let them out of prison to free up space and save money. Right. Are you fucking kidding me?
Oh, but also they're not using the same facilities. So the whole space thing is also ridiculous.
Yeah,
well, I highly doubt. I highly doubt that women's prisons are too, like, seriously overcrowded. Not the way men's are.
And they would still have to keep them open because there are still going to be some women that you can't let out of prison without endangering the public. Regardless of what feminists say about violent women and how much they want to blame female violence on a partner or on circumstances or on various other factors, women are violent for the same reasons that men are violent. And women who are violent are dangerous for the same reasons that men who are violent are dangerous. Because they don't care, you know, in all honesty, when they're the women that are violent who end up in jail because of their violence, they don't care who they hurt. And so it is not, it's not going to save a dime. It still costs the same amount of money to run the facility. It still costs money to staff the facility. It still costs money to staff the kitchen. It still costs money to heat the facility, to basically run all of the utilities. It's ridiculous to say that it would save a dime, really, to let women out of prison just because they're women. And if they really wanted to save a lot of money, they could very easily start looking at how many men they put in prison for minor crimes, like walking down the street with a joint in their pocket.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and then the one case that you mentioned, right, of the you stab your boyfriend in the thigh with a bread knife, right? And it's not your first act of violence against him. There's an ongoing pattern of you being abusive and violent towards him. And you also have a history of, drug abuse and bad behavior in general and all of that. But you have a promising career. You're in medical school and you have a promising career. And the judge just can't bring himself to incarcerate you and have that be ruined for you, right? And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, so, and then there was the one guy in university who, he had a promising career, he had all kinds of promising things that, he had going for him. And he was on his way to a better and brighter future, right? And I don't know, maybe he just annoyed a woman that he had sex with. And then she went to the women's center to talk through her feelings about it because, he didn't, we had sex, we hooked up, we're both drunk. He didn't call, he's not answering my texts, and I just feel like I'm not happy about the experience. Right? Just overall. And the women's center counselors will convince her that it was rape because she'd had 4 drinks, right? And that guy gets to lose his future, right? He gets to lose his future. But this woman with this track record, but she's so young and she's so pretty and, and she's so talented and she's so smart. And I mean, sure, she's a hot fucking mess of bipolar and borderline personality disorders, all just fucking jammed into her skull. And sure, she's violent and breaks the law in multiple other ways. And we know that, but,
she's just so cute, though.
And counseling, right? She could benefit from some counseling. And then she'll really it'll be fine.
Women really aren't violent at their core. They're cooperative and supportive of each other. And that's why we want to make the world more like women. Because it'll be so much more cooperative and supportive and helpful. And, it'll just be lovely, won't it?
Well, one of the cases in that was brought up in that sort of national debate in the 1920s was there was this woman who she got engaged, she got engaged to a man, and I guess, once, because this is how borderlines work, right? Borderline personality syndrome people, or disorder people, they will be super, super nice, super exciting, really, and the initial emotional thing is usually very intense. The sex is usually really intense too, right? And they rope you in and you fall for them really fast. And then they lock you down in some way or lock you in some way, right? So you get engaged, right? It would be these days, it would be get married. But back in the 1920s, because they had heart balm lawsuits and women could sue if a man broke off an engagement and get monetary damages for that. Because of that, that would be the first instance where a woman would feel like she had locked the guy down. She'd essentially chained him to her. He has publicly announced that they are engaged, and then all of a sudden, that's when the switch gets flipped, and they feel safe enough to behave in whatever way they want, right? To treat you however they want, and that's when the abuse starts, right? So this guy, right, I'm guessing probably was in a situation where he got engaged to this girl and then she starts becoming a complete fucking nightmare, right? And so what does he do? He breaks off the engagement and she shoots him in the stomach and he dies. And then she cries on the stand and is acquitted by a jury.
Well, this is one of the reasons that they started putting women on juries was because prosecutors basically said they could not get a jury of men to convict a woman because of how effective a woman's tears were and how women could get away with basically pleading, I'm a woman, I can't be evil, I can't be a bad person, I can't have done this because I was malicious. There have to have been I'm a victim of my circumstances. Poor me. And it took getting women on the jury to call bullshit on other women for doing that. Because women have been pulling that on men for centuries,
well, and I think
to varying degrees.
I think, too, it needs to be looked at that jury duty is a duty. It's not a right. It's an obligation, right? And it's one of those obligations that women were exempted from. And it wasn't necessarily that the reasons for that weren't necessarily because we can't trust women's judgment or whatever, because women were lawyers at this time. Women were judges at this time. Often women judges would be able to see through, the tears and the sob story, right? So, I mean, if you were a prosecutor, if you were a defense attorney defending a woman who had killed a man or done something horrible like that, and you were up against a female judge, you definitely wanted a jury trial, not judge only. But essentially, it was. Jury duty is inconvenient. Nobody fucking likes it, right? And so this was one of those things where women were exempted from a specific obligation, right? That was an inconvenience, and nobody, like men don't want to do it. It pays next to nothing, right? And you don't get compensated for your lost wages. And they were like, oh, should we really force women to do this too? Right? So it wasn't even that they were, that the system was saying, oh, we can't have women on juries because they can't be trusted to make the right decision. No, it was because, it would inconvenience women. It's the same fucking argument to keep women out of the draft now. Right?
We also had, for the longest time, women were exempt, at least upper class women were exempt from having to face the rougher side of life in every way that society could exempt them. So you wouldn't have seen society trying to put women on jury duty in cases where there'd been a murder, or in cases where there'd been a rape, or in cases where there'd been some other significantly violent crime, because that would be forcing them to face the rougher side of life. And with women being sheltered and protected, why would society have said, well, we're going to shelter and protect women all the time, except jury duty. We're going to make them look at dead bodies and listen to descriptions of how somebody was killed and stuff like that, because they can handle it then. It was just consistent with the way society sheltered women.
It's interesting. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting because if you think about it, the whole idea of women even as criminals is relatively new and basically has to come out of forensic evidence. Because up until then, unless you walked in with her with the gun or the knife in her hand, I think generally speaking, it was just presumed also that women, as this presumption of in the gynocentric society of women as being innocent and soft and kind and incapable of violence. It even takes until we have to have such an enormous, overwhelming amount of forensic evidence to even start to prosecute women. And even then, they still get away with it.
Oh, well, and the way women commit crimes historically has led to this. I mean, there's this myth in criminology that they're female serial killers really don't exist. Now, female serial killers, they are different enough from the typical male serial killer. A male serial killer generally leaves a pile of like a trail of obviously murdered bodies in his wake, and often will go out of his way to get attention to what he's doing, for what he's doing, right? He wants people to know that he's out there doing this. But female serial killers, they more typically operate in ways that are concealed. So, they'll use poison, or they will operate within the bounds of close relationships. So, you get the black widows who serially murder their husbands, and there was this one case, I read about it, some of the stories on it that were in the news at the time, on the unknown history of misandry. I think it was in the 1800s, and this woman ran a nursery and orphanage for young unmarried women, right? And so if you were a young woman and you got pregnant out of wedlock and you were poor and you had nowhere else to turn, she would take you in and help you have the baby, and then she would look after the baby until she could adopt it out. And she managed to rack up what they believe now are hundreds of murdered babies. She didn't adopt out a single one, right?
Jesus.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really, but I mean, like, how do you detect that? Particularly in a situation like that where there's all this secrecy, none of these women want to talk about it. They're going to her because they want to keep it all under wraps. And so it's essentially, the whole thing is a big secret. It's shrouded in secrecy and shame. So nobody's going to blow the whistle. Nobody's going to get suspicious and blow the whistle on this woman, because then they'd have to admit that they got pregnant out of wedlock. And so it was just a massive, massive situation where this woman was able to avoid detection for years and years and years while she was murdering babies.
There's been a few stories actually of female nurses that have done that as well, where they've injected patients, or they've killed a number of babies, newborns, in this manner. And there's also another means of killing that women do that is unusual for men, and it often goes undetected simply because of the way it's done. Although now forensics is making it more and more detectable depending on the methods used, and that's somebody mentioned it in the chat, and it's gone. I can't see it now, but it was Munchausen's by proxy.
Oh yeah,
that's the one way in which female killers do seek attention. And they don't seek it through specifically killing necessarily. They seek it through playing not exactly the victim, but the long-suffering caregiver of somebody who is ill. And then, of course, it turns out that that individual is ill because of the woman who is playing the long-suffering caregiver. And it's interesting the way it was portrayed in that M. Night Shyamalan movie, the one that everybody...
Sixth Sense.
Yeah, like, that was before everybody knew his method, so everybody was like, oh, you gotta see this movie, this is a cool new thing, right? And then he did the same thing over and over again for all the rest of his movies. But the portrayal of Munchausen's by proxy in that movie was interesting in that it was a lot more blatant. Though that woman would have been caught simply because there would have been a detection of the damage to the child's system, unless they, forbade an autopsy or something. And there was a story that we talked about on one of the Voice for Men radio shows a couple of years ago that when it came out, it's one that rips your guts out. There was a child that died of salt poisoning. And if you've ever had too much salt in your system at once, it's very painful. It can be, before it gets to the point where it's potentially deadly, it gives you gut-wrenching diarrhea and vomiting. And so for this to have happened, it was just, for it to have been done to him on purpose is beyond reprehensible. It's monstrous. And there was very strong suspicion that that the mother had done that to the child, and it was basically through the child's medication, or the way they were feeding the child.
And with
Jesus,
and it was the child either was on a feeding tube or some other sort of system, like a drip. There was something, I can't remember the whole story, but there was a way that liquid was being introduced to the child's body that wasn't through the mouth, and that was essentially how they figured the salt got in.
This is interesting. I actually just looked this up. Did a quick search on it. I found this study. It looks pretty legitimate to me, but this was actually, interestingly enough, in this study, with particularly looking at Munchausen's by proxy, it's a doctoral dissertation, so that always means you should take a little bit of grain of salt. Dawn Hurst 2005 seems to indicate that actually when jurors were given two different defendants, one of which was female, one of which was male, who were accused of Munchausen's by proxy, they actually did view the woman as more responsible. And I think that's because there is an element of caregiving to what happened, or misattribution of caregiving to the Munchausen's by proxy case, in contrast to how we typically think men abuse children through beating or physical violence that's more blatant than this kind of thing, which is viewed as a feminine. And I think it is, because I was actually looking for the statistics on what's the gender ratio between people who commit Munchausen's by proxy. But that's interesting. I could see that as being possible, that we view Munchausen's as a female crime, because it probably is.
Well, it is. Munchausen and Munchausen's by proxy they're both more likely to be in women than in men, and you have to realize that Munchausen just on its own isn't the same as hypochondria.
Right.
With hypochondria, you really genuinely believe that you're sick. But with Munchausen's, would you stop running around? With Munchausen's, it's essentially you like, some of these people will actually poison themselves. They will swallow bottles of pills. They will take pills that they know are going to make them very, very sick. And like one of the most. But here's an interesting thing, because there was an extreme case, and I can guarantee you this woman had Munchausen. An extreme case brought to national attention in part by Al Franken years ago. And it was a woman who she worked for KBR, which is a military contractor, I think in Iraq. And she lied on all of her application forms, said she'd never had to take medicine for any kind of mental problem when she'd been on antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds in the past, and all of this, right? But she essentially, she drunkenly hooked up with one of her male coworkers while she was deployed, in overseas. And then she claimed that she had been raped, and some of the injuries that she was describing, like massive tears, torn rotator cuff. She said one of her breast implants had ruptured, because it was so violent, whatever. But she was examined the next morning by a doctor who said, a female doctor, no less, who said, she doesn't seem to have any physical injuries. She's got a little bit of, fissures, in the vaginal and anal area, but that's not inconsistent with vigorous sex. And other than that, she's like, other than just like normal, what you get when you have a good night, right? But she had these, and then she elaborated on this story. It was like this crazy thing because she said she reported the rape to KBR, and then KBR put her in a storage container for like 48 hours or something before airlifting her home. And she was held captive there by men with guns who worked for KBR and all of this stuff, right? And it was all fucking bullshit. All of it was bullshit. Like, KBR doesn't arm any of their security. None of them have guns, right? And they, you know, like, and it just, the entire thing was so unbelievable. Then during the trial, right, because Al Franken helped get the laws changed, the federal legislation changed. It used to be that if an employee had this type of grievance with a military contractor, it would go to binding arbitration. It would go to a mediator, and it would be settled sort of in-house, and there would be a legal settlement, and employees were not allowed to sue. And he ended up convincing the government to change that law and allow her to sue. So she sued. She took KBR to court. All of this shit came out. And you know what else came out? She'd also made all kinds of rape accusations against her doctors historically. And she had been hospitalized multiple times for things that nobody could figure out what was wrong with her. And the nurses had observed that, you know, she'll be walking down the hallway in the hospital like a normal person, and then when she realizes that one of the nurses is looking at her, she just suddenly feels faint and collapses, right? Like, and the whole thing, oh, I blacked out and my psychiatrist raped me and all of this stuff, right?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so it was like, and the woman is a fucking nutter, and she's saying, she's like post-traumatic, can't leave the house, can't fucking do anything since this horrible traumatic incident with KBR. But during the 2 or 3 years between when this happened to her, when she said this happened to her, and when the trial was going on, what did she do? She completed 2 university degrees. She courted someone, married, and had 2 children, right? She testified before fucking Congress, right? She wrote articles. She started a fucking foundation for victims of sexual assault, right? Became a poster child for that, right? Somehow she did all of this when she was so agoraphobic and traumatized that she couldn't fucking leave her house, right? I mean, like, this woman is just fucking insane.
Well, one thing that I wanted to mention, because this story is very much like some of the things that I would experience when I was volunteering. And again, I can't give the details on this due to ethics concerns, but you can really tell the difference between somebody who is legitimately seeking help and somebody who is, well, trying to tell stories, because the people who are trying to tell stories are either the most unlucky people in the entire world, or, well, they're fabricating falsehoods because they just string off this list of things that are happening that are just the most terrible, egregious things. And it's just like, okay, well, you know, you've said that these things have happened to you, and you also have said that you've gone to the police. But if you did that, there's no way in God's green earth that whoever is doing these things to you would still be walking free, because that just would not happen. So you can really tell when somebody is trying to tell a story just to get attention, and it's ridiculous. And basically it's just like they're trying to call in to have somebody else validate them. And the trick there is basically not to say, oh, these things, that's so terrible that happened to you, that this is also obviously true. It's basically just to tell them, like, oh yeah, why don't you go tell the police? Why don't you go and get some help? Because really, in those cases, that's often what they actually need is some help to work through these things, these attention-seeking trends, because they can often result in innocent people having accusations made against them when taken to their logical conclusion, which is just ridiculous.
And going back to kind of the topic at hand, the thing that's so um, awful about the current system being the way that it is that they don't even really have to go to the police anymore. They don't have to get help. You can just sling these accusations, and there is no accountability. It's I mean, on some level, it does go that far, but in terms of the court of public opinion, all that needs to happen is an accusation.
Yeah.
And in contrast, if you make an accusation against a woman, it doesn't matter how much evidence you have. You have to have some very solid evidence, particularly when it comes to criminal investigations. Because again, this is interesting though. I read this study. Well, I skimmed it real quick. So, but in that Munchausen's case, it basically said that if you were abused by a woman and you were someone who had suffered from Munchausen's, the jury was more willing to give you more money and be more harsh against the female perpetrator. So that might be an instance where we would see this is emotional abuse. Might see more stringency and strictness towards women from a legal standpoint, at least from jurors. Still, you're going to have judges who do shit like, oh, well, she has such a bright future. But maybe if it's the emotional stuff, people are more likely to associate women with these negative effects.
Well, but
it may be partly due to the fact that women are viewed as natural caregivers, and it's something that women also perpetuate. We portray ourselves as natural caregivers, and we take that role and we live it. And then when a woman comes along who commits an egregious breach of that role, it's like a betrayal of all society. It's very much like when men commit an egregious breach of the protector role, and how society treats men as deadbeats when they're even just thrust into the provider role and they don't fill it to society's satisfaction. So I mean, it's one of those things where in any area where a woman is held accountable, it's because she's failing at a gender role.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's largely true, not entirely, because we do have infanticide laws that essentially make an allowance for mothers to murder their infants under 1 year old, if they can demonstrate that the after effects of the pregnancy and birth and lactation were affecting their state of mind.
Yeah,
and
they
that
have to
comes
basically
with a lighter penalty.
They have to basically prove that they were incapable of fulfilling that role. In other words, something that's an out that men don't get.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually didn't know that. I mean, I figured they probably would have gotten a lighter sentence, but I didn't know that there was basically an out.
Well, it's for like postpartum psychosis,
Mhm.
right?
The other thing you got to understand with this is this degree of accountability gap that actually goes one shade farther. In the United States, I believe in Canada, also in the UK, in other areas of Europe, there are laws that exempt women from abandonment charges if they drop off their baby at designated areas. Like some places it's hospitals, some places it's law enforcement agencies, or basically first responder stations. Right, and they're allowed to do that specifically because if they don't allow that, there's a percentage of young girls who will kill their babies to get out of the stigma and responsibility of teen motherhood. And this is the dumpster baby phenomenon, is directly related to the creation of safe haven abandonment laws. Like that is society's response. Not we need to scare the shit out of young girls and make them understand that this is murder and they'll go to jail. Nope, we need to give all women an out. Let them get out of parenthood free card.
It's just more evidence that feminism is needed, right? Because then we would have more support for these young girls who get pregnant early, and there would be more resources for them, and then they wouldn't have to kill their babies. So clearly this is the answer.
Yeah, back when the Monopoly card, oh shoot, I can't think of what it's called, where you You end up having to pay into the community chest. That's what it is. The community chest used to be a real thing. And I learned about it in an odd way. I was watching, I think it was Turner Classic Movies with my parents, and they had this old Andy Hardy film. Andy Hardy was a character played by Mickey Rooney when he was young enough to look like a teenager, which was actually kind of for a long time. And he played this character whose father was a judge, and you know, they had a decent amount of income, but still had to deal with middle class issues. You know, it was that kind of a family setting. And Andy Hardy wanted $200 to buy a car, and he was trying to get his father to give him the $200 to buy this car, and his father was going to donate $200 to the community chest. And he went around and he showed him all of the charities that the community chest supported. One of them was a home for, they called it back then, wayward women. You know, of course, women are victims of their own choices, right? Through no fault of their own, somehow they got stricken by the penis-shaped wand of the knock-up fairy, and they got pregnant. And
I
now
doubt
they
they
end
were
up
even.
in this.
I doubt those women were even in the same room at the time.
Oh no, no.
Right?
It was clearly it was the knock-up fairy and not sex with some guy, right? And it was the guy's fault if it was, of course, right? But so they're in this situation, and these poor women. Well, what society did was they donated to this type of charity that provided a place for women to stay. It provided job training for them to get the types of jobs where they would have the possibility of childcare. They wouldn't be working in factories. They wouldn't be working in rough settings. They'd be working in offices and sheltered settings. They might go to, back then it was called normal school, where you got your teaching degree. You didn't go to university for 4 years. You just went. It was actually called normal school too. That's the funny thing. And they would get them set up so that they could have a income, that they could, if they wanted to keep custody of their child, they could provide care for their child. If they were looking to adopt out, their child could be adopted. You know, that was a big thing, and it's kind of gone now. And I think part of the reason it's gone is because people don't view it as a necessity, because we have a welfare system, and we have abortion, and we have all these types of birth control. But teen pregnancy hasn't gone down. If you count all of the aborted fetuses in with all of the live births, teen pregnancy has skyrocketed exponentially post Roe versus Wade. So obviously something like this would still be necessary.
Okay, but when was Roe v. Wade?
72.
Okay, yeah, no, but that was after the war on poverty started.
Yep.
Right?
So you already had. Is that your dog in the background, or did you kidnap Curly?
Okay, no,
ringtone.
It's Dr. Zoidberg. Why not Zoidberg?
There we go.
And
it's just perfect for this discussion. But yeah, no, when welfare started it, and it started it with taking the father out of the home, but you have that phenomenon wherein girls who are raised in a single mother welfare dependent home are 50% more likely to get pregnant out of wedlock. Boys who are raised in a single mother run welfare dependent home are 50% more likely to impregnate out of wedlock. So the problem perpetuates itself, because you end up with the next generation on welfare raising children unmarried, and their children are more likely than their parents, and so on.
It's worse. It's worse than that, right? Because what's going to happen, what's going to start happening, and what has been happening is that things are going to start to become earlier and earlier and earlier, right? Because the menarche has been just on average age of menarche has been going down for the last 120 years or so, since they started, really tracking the records and like picking through medical files and historical records and stuff, right? So, but when it comes to a girl who's raised with no father in the home, right? She might have a father, even a father who's involved, right? And sort of, you know, spending time with her. But if he's not in the home, then she will reach menarche earlier, right? And she will become sexually active earlier.
I heard that it's even earlier with like a stepfather figure in the picture as well.
Yeah,
the data I've seen say biological father figure makes a huge difference.
Yes, it does. And it's because that is the, you know, in terms of like statistical reality, which seems to actually have an impact on our evolution. Oh my goodness. Because the father is the adult male who is going to be the most invested in the safety and provisioning of that girl, other than her future husband. Okay, so this is the man, and when that man's not around, right? What does she do? What does her biology program her to do? Right? Sexually mature faster, so you can go find the next best guy. Right? The next best protector and provider, right? Which is a mate. Go actively seek that. So reach sexual maturity earlier and go start having sex earlier. That's what her biology is going to tell her to do if biological dad isn't around enough.
This is something that, this is probably the biggest area where the fail at female accountability causes harm to society, because there's a lot of other areas in which the accountability gap kind of hinges on this. When you start out from the standpoint of a single mom who raises children without their father around by choice because she got pregnant out of wedlock, and she's welfare dependent, and she does nothing to improve her situation, and she does nothing to improve her children's situation, and then her children have negative outcomes, or they have their outcomes are not as good as they could have been because their mother was not dedicated to their welfare. And then you have, you know, it goes on generationally. You have this progression of younger and younger unwed parenting. You have more and more crime. You have more and more poverty in this situation. And at the other end of it, you have society condemning men for something that women are essentially in control of. We talked about this in the reproductive rights end of the accountability gap. But this contributes to the accountability gap in criminal law, in that a lot of times girls who grow up to engage in, because girls are 50% more likely to end up on the wrong side of the law too, in circumstances where they are raised in a poverty situation, without a father in the home, without the attention of their mother, you know, and in a neighborhood that is a high crime neighborhood because they're poor, because they're living in housing that's paid for by the government, and so on. A lot of this hinges on single motherhood by choice. You know,
but I mean, like, you have to look at the whole picture, right?
Well,
because
everybody, they are able to look back at that in the courtroom and say, well, I ended up in this situation because of all these things. It's not my fault. Bat the big doe eyes, and boom, the judge is like, oh, okay, you know, you poor thing.
I know, but what's so frustrating about this in particular, because being raised by a single mother contributes to criminality, it contributes to gang activity, drug and alcohol abuse, all of these things, right? Behavioral disorders, all of these things are, you know, really disproportionately present in children of single moms compared to the average. So I mean, like, and if you want a comparison, right? A lifelong smoker, right, is 23 times more likely to get lung cancer than someone who has never smoked. Okay? But when it comes to running away and being homeless as juveniles, right, that's a 32 times higher risk if you were raised in a single parent household. And that's just compared against the average, not compared against, kids with two parents, that's compared against the average, right? So, and so essentially what we're looking at, we're looking at like extremely highly correlated phenomenon. And what happened necessarily when we removed the stigma from single mothers is we removed the motivation of any man, the social motivation to make an honest woman out of her, right? Now he can just give money, right? Now all he has to do is give money. And one of the horrible things is that the state has outcompeted the vast majority of men who are in lower income brackets, right? So a woman on welfare, depending on what state she's in, right, when it comes to monetary, like actual cash benefits and subsidies, right, and like discounts and food stamps and WIC and all of this stuff, right, that she gets, some of them in the form of cash or cash equivalent, and some of them in the form of, you get to live in co-op housing or subsidized housing or whatever, right? What you are looking at is any man that wants to actually be a present father and make her an honest woman he has to earn at least $60,000 a year to make it worth her while to choose him over the government.
Just to kind of go off what you were saying, and also to kind of tie it back into the intro video, you're right. There are a lot of problems for single mother households in which the children are often raised in poverty. They will turn to male figures in gangs for that male support, and they'll often achieve lower educational levels. They'll have fewer job opportunities, that kind of thing, and then they'll eventually wind up being more likely to turn to illicit activities to move forward. But interestingly enough, like we were talking about in the intro, the possibility of women not going to prison because, oh my goodness, we can find better ways of dealing with these problems. And interestingly, there is a system in Norway that does, in fact, treat people differently. When they go to prison, it's not really a prison per se. It's an area where they can go. They're treated like human beings. They're given education. They're given career training, and that area has one of the lowest rates of recidivism ever. So it would, in fact, be ideal to have both men and women be treated in this way. But that's the thing. They're not advocating for this for men. They're only advocating for it for women. But if they wanted to be equal, if they actually wanted to have positive results, they would advocate for this sort of thing for both people rather than the god-awful for-profit system that the states have currently.
Well, one of the things that I find hilarious is that they, like these social justice advocates, especially particularly when talking about Black and Hispanic people, right, will essentially say that the prison system is set up just the criminal justice system in general is set up in such a way that it almost necessitates recidivism, right? Yeah. The way, like, if you're not a criminal, but you fucked up once, right? And then you go to prison, you come out the other side of that a criminal. And you're either a criminal because you learned it in prison, or you're a criminal by necessity because now you have a criminal record and nobody's going to hire you. And so what the fuck are you going to do to feed yourself, right? So, I mean, essentially it generates recidivism and does not. But when you look at you look at the approaches, the different approaches that the justice system takes for men and women, right? So whereas a man will get 5 years in prison, a woman might get community service and mandatory counseling for her equally serious offense, right? Okay, so and then they say, well, men are treated more harshly in the system because they have a higher recidivism rate. Well, okay, but you just said when it came to Black men that it's the system itself that necessitates recidivism, right? You just said that treating Black men in this way in the criminal justice system turns them into lifelong offenders because they don't have any other choice once they come out the other side of it, right? And so, like, the whole thing is just this huge fucking circular argument as to why, like they'll say, oh, the reason men are more harshly treated is because they're more likely to offend, and it's like, oh, or more likely to be criminals. And it's like, no, maybe they're not. You follow the numbers back, you take all those discounts away. I'm pretty sure that men aren't that substantially more likely to engage in criminal acts than women. Like, maybe it's 60-40, right?
Yeah, maybe different acts, maybe, but also, it totally, the cyclical nature of this, it's so overwhelming. I'll hold off though on that.
Well, it's horrible. It's horrible because if you're a woman and you got community service and mandatory counseling, and maybe you were nice enough and cried prettily enough that the prosecutor said, oh, and your record will be expunged in 5 years, right? Or it's easy to get a pardon, right, and a waiver. Like, if those things are easier for women than they are for men, then of course what you're doing is you're snowballing this whole fucking cycle of gender differences in treatment between men and women, right? And you're using the results of the differences in treatment as a justification to continue doing it.
I want to point out that cyclical nature is actually important to the discussion, and if Aidan, if you wanted to elaborate on that a bit, it probably would be a valuable addition to the discussion.
Yes, it would.
Well, I think, first of all, so we started off by talking about the fact that what seems to be a major contributing factor into this, it's fatherless homes. And in the data that I've seen on it, where all of the factors that we have discussed here, higher proclivity of teen pregnancy, all of a greater propensity towards criminality, in the correlational evidence I've seen, they all just call that risk-taking behavior. And it's highly correlated with sexual risk-taking behavior and also pretty much with single mother households. We find it time and time again. And then we have this system that over-criminalizes men, makes men more likely to end up not capable of being father figures, and perpetuates an ongoing system of fatherless homes that produce children that are far more likely to have this propensity towards risk-taking behavior that lands them themselves into this cyclical prison system.
And I want to add to that, if you look at the part of, let's see, which paper was it? It was Dorner's paper, I believe, where she pointed out, pointed out in her 2009 report that these differences hit harder in ethnic minorities, certain ethnic minorities, and you look at the welfare system has hit some of those ethnic minorities first before it hit whites. And you see that greater
before
gender
it hit
gap.
whites to any degree.
To any degree, yeah, to any degree. And so you ended up with an entire generational difference in which ethnic groups had more fatherless homes. And you also see, at least in American society, there is an ethnic difference in the demonstrable display of masculinity among men. And it does seem to hit guys who grow up in neighborhoods or in sort of the culture of the area where they live, and the culture of the people that they have to be around every day, and also the culture within the prison system if they get stuck in that system, get caught up in that system, starting even in the juvenile detention system, and that happens with a lot of guys, is that they're basically their gender signaling, has to be more overt, and it has to be more rugged, and it has to be a greater display of capability of enforcing one's territory and one's boundaries. And this is something that that seems to be the groups of people that are hit with a harder gender gap. And what I pointed out in the opening was from Dorner's report. I'm going to repeat it. She wrote, explaining the in her report, explaining the gender gap in sentencing outcomes, an investigation of differential treatment in U.S. federal courts, that prior research had found greater racial disparities in sentencing and drug crimes. In her research, she had found that the gender gap in both the odds and length of incarceration in drug crimes is larger for Black and Hispanic offenders than whites. And this is something that, when I read that, I thought, they're getting socked into jail because they're manlier. They're specifically, you know, they're viewed as manlier, they're viewed as tougher, or they're working to try to be viewed as manlier or tougher. And they're getting treated as more responsible, more accountable for their behavior than the women are, because the women survive in that same environment consistently by turning to government. And so when they go into the prosecuting attorney's meeting, you know, for, well, we're going to offer you a plea bargain, they're more likely to turn to the government as a helper, whereas the guy is more likely to see the government as an attacker, and he's not going to see the prosecutor as his friend. And the prosecutor is going to be the same way. He's going to see the guy as more accountable for what he did, and he's not going to cut him as much slack. So you have that situation as well, and that hits that. I think that really plays into that cycle very, very hard, and it's something that, it's a prejudice in the system, and it's a sexism within the system, and it's unique, I think, to minorities that were hit by the welfare system first, and that have had to change the way they developed socially as a result. So that's something that, and I don't think women have necessarily the experience, you know, even watching it happen to the guys around them. I don't think they have the experience to fully grasp what happens to a guy in that circumstance, because he's basically one big target.
And they aren't really going to, and they have to know on some level that the things that happen to men under the system are not realistically ever going to happen to them. So it does place you in a position where, how can you have true, you know, I mean, you can have sympathy, but you can't really empathize typically from that position, considering you have to know that's not a possibility for you. These aren't things that affect your life.
Well, you see that in women who say things like, you know, this is an unpopular opinion, you guys, but I'm okay with a few innocent men getting thrown under the bus if we can catch more rapists and blah, 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 like that one.
Yeah, I know. We all know you're okay with it, bitch. Right? Like what the, like, oh, yeah, because no skin off your fucking nose. You stupid bitch, right? Like,
thank
yeah,
you so
oh
much
God,
for
everybody
your sacrifice.
was so mad at her, and rightfully so. It's not her neighbors, it's not her family, it's not her friends, it's not her kids that this is happening to. She doesn't live in the kind of neighborhood where that happens to the men.
Oh no, it does happen to men. It happens to men in college. It happens
I know
to
it
men
does,
in,
but this
you know, but
she doesn't live in the neighborhood where that's a typical thing that happens to guys, where they know walking down the street that they're going to get hassled, and they know that.
No, but what I'm saying is,
for who they are, they're a target.
No, but what I'm saying is, she's saying, right? And I know exactly who Prim is talking about. She's saying a few men falsely convicted is a price I'm willing to pay, right? I'm willing. You're paying the price. You're not paying the price, you stupid whore, right?
No, she's definitely not.
Right? But if that's the price that I have to pay to dismantle patriarchy, is what she said, right? Or to end patriarchy. Like, are you fucking kidding me? You dumb, stupid, hubristic, arrogant bitch, right?
Completely,
because you are not paying any price there. This is not a sacrifice that you are making, right? No, you are essentially saying, well, you know, if a few Jews need to go into ovens to like make us Aryans great again, right? Oh, that's a price I'm willing to pay. Like, what?
And this is something that
Fuck.
is repeated throughout feminism. And this is like, I have heard that argument over and over and over again the entire time I've been a men's rights activist. And before I knew that there was a men's rights movement, I would get into arguments, particularly about the from the time I was in school and everything, the growing treatment of drunk sex as a rape situation. This idea that it's okay to sacrifice some men to false accusations in order to protect women and girls from what feminists see as a worse crime than crimes that kill, maim, and destroy you. Which I never really understood. That they've expressed that. I've heard that
for
expressed
20 minutes. For 20 minutes, you
oh
got.
My God!
For
It makes me want to smack somebody.
Like, no, and what they're describing as that crime now, right? Because it used to be there used to have to be an element of force. You used to have to prove resistance. You know, like it used to have to be something that, oh my God, I really don't want to have sex with this person. Like, absolutely not. No, 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 no. Right now, what they're describing is this horrendous crime that is worse than death, that is worse than getting cancer, that is worse than watching your child die of cancer. Apparently, right? It's worse than anything else. It is the worst possible thing that they can imagine. Okay, what qualifies as that crime is spending 20 minutes getting dicked when you weren't quite enthusiastic about it, right? Like when you had ambivalent feelings about it, when you were like, oh, like, fuck, do I really want to have sex right now? Like,
or when you feel guilty about it later, and you can say, well, I had a beer, I shouldn't have made that decision.
I guess I can throw my husband a bone tonight, right? Like, you know, it's not that big a deal, you know, but that's now rape, right? Because you weren't 100% into it, right?
Well, hell, Karen.
Or you agreed to try something new and didn't enjoy it. And the fact that you didn't enjoy it now means that you were raped, or you had a few drinks, right?
Don't forget about the co-ed who gave her friend's passed out, blacked out, drunk boyfriend a blowjob, and then turned around and accused him of rape because she said she didn't consent to what she did to him.
Yeah, no, and the worst fucking thing in that entire fucking fiasco, he's blacked out, he's passed out, right? She sucks him off, okay? She texts her friends and her resident fucking student advisor dorm person who's like the advisor guy. I don't know what the fucking lingo is, right? And says, I was all me. I wasn't an innocent bystander, right? But oh shit, I just fucking blew my my roommate's boyfriend, right? That was probably not a smart thing to do, right? And then she texts some other guy and says, you know, I wasn't quite satisfied with blowing an unconscious guy. Can you hook up with me? Would that be like, I really feel like I want to have sex tonight, right? Okay, so, and she's the victim, okay? She's the victim, apparently. She reports that as him raping her, okay? And then because he had no idea that any of this had happened until he was like brought up on fucking an accusation, and he's like, holy shit, did she suck my dick that night while I was fucking passed out and blacked out? I have no memory of that. Like, what the fuck? So then he tries to file a complaint that she did that to him, and the university said, you can't actually lodge a complaint about that because that would be considered retaliation against the victim.
Some victim. Like I said, women are victim of their own choices. I am going to go through, because I've been delaying it here, but I'm going to start reading off some of our super chats because we're amassing quite a list here. And, you know, poor Joey Jojo's going to end up having a hole in his wallet the size of a truck if he keeps giving us $2 here and there. So we started with Field of Bears, who gave us $5 and said, can't wait for the next 3-hour social science lecture. I wish we could still go for 3 hours at a time, but unfortunately, we can't because I gotta go to work tonight. Joey Jojo's first one is, he gave us $5 and he said, honestly, I wish women did not have free will at all. I wish women were just machines that men can control because you ladies can't control yourself. That's the problem with modern society, is that too many people actually believe that women can control themselves and they choose not to, and they should be accountable when they choose not to. And it is lazy, malicious, or otherwise wrong when a woman chooses not to control herself, as much as it is when a man chooses not to control himself. Women do not need that pass. And it is not beneficial, not truly beneficial to anybody when women are given that pass. Women get immediate benefits, but in the long term, that is a barrier to greatness. Not being accountable is a barrier to greatness. This is why achievers are mostly men, because men have to suck it up and drive on, and men have to be accountable when they fuck up, and men have to be accountable for getting done what they started and for taking care of what's in front of them. And if women had that same accountability, you might see more female achievers than we see now.
One of the things that Bill Whittle said, Bill Whittle is a conservative commenter. He does his stuff through PJ Media, which is Helen Smith is associated with them. But what he said, what he described as white privilege, he said, white privilege exists. And white privilege is the privilege of having nobody else to blame. Right? Because having nobody else to blame but yourself means that you have to get better, right? You have to actually take things on yourself. You have to actually, there's no excuses, right? You have to actually get it done. And I mean, I'm not necessarily certain how well that applies to white privilege, because I think white privilege actually exists in other forms. You know, whites are the majority in most of the countries we're talking about, and that affords them some social benefits and stuff like that. But when it comes to male privilege, that really seems to be the case. Male privilege is the privilege of not having anyone to blame but yourself. So you are forced to get better. And then when you get better and you outcompete the others, that is your privilege, right? That is when you are perceived as privileged. Privilege is when you have gotten better enough, right, to outcompete the others.
Yeah, exactly. This is why I say, even though yes, there are immediate compelling rewards for being able to make all of the excuses in the world, in the long term, it's very damaging. It's very damaging to any group of people to have excuses provided for them to not improve and not get better, to not do their best. So we have Jonathan Rossler, gave us $5. He says, one question we can ask from this is not whether women should receive a harsh sentence, but maybe whether men should actually receive similar sentences. And this is something that I was thinking as well. It's why I asked that question close to the end. Do we want do we want to consider if harsh sentences actually are wrong, if when feminists lobby for alternatives to incarceration for women, that therapeutic sentences are actually more effective in rehabilitating offenders, and at the other end of that rehabilitation they come out and they don't commit more crimes and they become productive taxpayers. If that's what we want, shouldn't we be doing it for men too? And I think in terms of, especially in terms of minor crimes, like somebody gets involved, and if we're gonna police drugs, which I don't think we should be doing anyway, but if we're gonna police drugs, and we're gonna police the behaviors that surround drug use that would not be illegal if drug use was not involved, then we should also be considering the fact that these are not people who are necessarily criminal by nature and who simply need a leg up to get back on track with their lives. And it doesn't matter whether they're male or female. If there is a therapeutic, rehabilitative option that works, that's what we should be doing instead of simple incarceration.
Yeah,
And,
well,
you know,
like that example that I provided earlier, it clearly has benefits. It gives them like something to work towards, something to give themselves purpose if they're struggling, if they don't have anywhere to go but to illicit activity to help themselves survive. This gives them something to work towards and help themselves improve. It should be the obvious solution, but you can really see where a lot of feminists are clearly biased in where they're going because they're not advocating for equal treatment. They're saying, no, women should have all of these benefits, but clearly men don't need it because they're already the more violent ones, and we've already addressed the cycle. But yeah, you can just see the bias there.
I think one of the hardest parts of our society's evolution is recognizing that just because someone fucks up in a criminal direction doesn't necessarily make them not human anymore. And we end up in a situation where we don't just other convicts and ex-convicts. We cut them off entirely. And this is something that I've watched in the workplace. It's something that I've watched in education settings. It's something that I've watched in a neighborhood setting. I've even seen it happen in church. And there's a degree, obviously.
There's some irony there.
Yeah, there's a great deal of irony there. And there's a degree like of distrust that's going to happen when somebody has committed a crime. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. You trust is something that you earn, and when you violate it, it is on you to earn it back. But I think there are times when, very frequently, when after we learn that someone has committed some form of theft, or that someone has engaged in violence against another person and they've been convicted of it, it hasn't just been, they got in a fight, but they actually did something violent for the sake of doing something violent, or for the sake of taking something or dominating or whatever, that we don't give them a chance to earn that trust back. Or we don't treat the things that people do to earn trust as deserving of trust. And that's a societal thing.
Oh, it is. And one of the things too that got me was, when a Voice for Men was, sorry, I have the hiccups. A Voice for Men was dealing with the Gordon Smith case years ago. And he's a guy from Vermont, and he was arrested 8 times based on 13 separate false accusations from his ex-wife during a custody battle. And, he essentially, and every single time, right, he was let go with no charges. He was, it was just like, yeah, no, there's nothing here. She said, he raped her on such and such a day at such and such a time. He had a receipt from like a store 10 miles away from the scene of the crime, right? And so he could always prove his whereabouts. And but they never did anything to her because it was like, she always had this sort of hazy excuse, because the allegations were always like about an incident that was, a few days or a week or 2 weeks or a month old. Right. And, so she could always say, oh, I must have misremembered the time and the date or whatever. I was in error about the exact place. Right. And, but then finally, the system, the judge ordered him to wear an ankle monitor because, I don't know, maybe the judge was smart enough to realize something fucked up was going on, right? And told him to wear an ankle monitor for his own good. But he was ordered, even though he'd never been charged with anything, much less convicted, to wear an ankle monitor. And so he's wearing an ankle monitor. And then one day she walks into an emergency room covered in bruises and scrapes and says, 20 minutes ago in this particular alley, just a few blocks away, he beat me up, right? And that was close enough between when she claimed the event happened and when she reported it, right? That the ankle monitor data completely exonerated the guy, and she was finally arrested for making false allegations, right? For filing false police reports. Sorry, I have the hiccups. I'm so sorry. But one of the things, he had to move away from Vermont. I think he moved to Georgia or something like that once he got partial custody of his kids. Not full custody, mind you, because she apparently wasn't badly behaved enough to actually make her lose custody. But he moved to another state because the entire time, years of time that he was going through this, right, in Vermont, apparently when people do a criminal record check, just, your employer or whatever, right, they do a criminal record check, it doesn't just give them access to charges or convictions. It gives them access to arrests, right? Have you ever been arrested? And of course, because he had been arrested 8 times, or however many times, right? He could never get a fucking job. They would always say, "Oh no, your criminal background check didn't check out," right? And so I mean, like that system itself doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that there might be such a thing as a false allegation of crime, that there might be such a thing as somebody who falsely reports a crime, and then the police move in to make an arrest immediately, and then it might all get sorted out, and doesn't allow for that.
And the really bad thing is the police don't really have a choice in the matter. If a woman walks into a police station or calls a police station, or someone calls a police station on her behalf and says that she was being abused by a partner, the way the law is written, arrest is mandatory. And it's not mandatory as in the cops will get written up, or the cops will get fired or whatever for not doing it. There is funding that police stations receive from the federal government that they won't get if it's demonstrated that they are not making these arrests. And if somebody files a complaint, they may be forced to give back funding that they got in the previous year. So there's sort of mandatory policies in a lot of, particularly urban police stations, because they need the bigger budget. There's mandatory policies, and it's mandatory arrest policy to arrest the guy if they show up when there is a complaint of domestic violence, and or a complaint of any kind of partner abuse, even in cases where the complaint is on behalf of the guy, and the woman is the one who is committing the abuse. And that tendency for those arrests to show up in job searches, in background checks for jobs and everything, I've seen that affect guys here in Ohio who have been through ordeals of malicious prosecution, where all the way through the ordeal, from beginning to end, there was never a time when it could not be conclusively proved that the accusation was false, that the accuser had lied to the police during the investigation, that the accuser had filed a false complaint, and when she went to court, the accuser perjured herself and got away with it. There were no repercussions for her for any of those crimes. There were never any arrests. There's no record out there that an employer is going to see if she applies for a job that they do a background check for. But if he so much as applies to work at a gas station now, they're going to know he was arrested 5 times. They're going to know that he had charges filed against him. They're not going to see anything that says he was acquitted. They just won't see anything that says he was convicted. And so that will affect, like, he can't get a job in any areas of security. The details of the arrests might not necessarily be available enough to give him the ability to get jobs in any money handling areas. He wouldn't be able to get a job in any area where he would be responsible as a caregiver. None of that stuff is open to him. He really, and at this point, the guy from the 7 Years in Hell story is unemployed, and he's been unemployed since the ordeal. And part of the reason is that he has post-traumatic stress disorder, but part of the reason is because any employer he applies with is going to look into his background, and they're going to see that he was arrested 5 times, and they will not see that it was wrongful arrest. And that's a repercussion that men face. Men are punished for being falsely accused.
Well, and the horrible thing too is that the social narrative, right? The cultural narrative, the media narrative is that women almost never lie about these things. And so if he's been arrested, he probably did it, and he just got off on a technicality or whatever, or he intimidated her into dropping the charges or whatever, right? That's the impression that's going to happen with an arrest that didn't amount to anything, is going to be that, you know, he got away with it, not that he was falsely accused.
They see arrest. They don't see that the ex accused him of all things, assaulting her at a bus stop, getting kicked in the nuts 3 times, and then after getting kicked in the nuts 3 times by a 230-pound, 5'10" woman running away at top speed during a time period when he was actually recovering from hernia surgery.
Yeah,
no, you know, he's Superman. No, they're not going to see that. And any place, like, if you want to get a job after that, you aren't going to go to Walmart, because the manager at Walmart doesn't process the applications, right? The corporate headquarters processes that side of the applications. You're going to go to a mom and pop shop someplace that can only pay you minimum wage and doesn't have to give you benefits, and go in and say, look, man, I'm in a situation. This is my history. I am actually 100% innocent. I can bring in references. Can you give me a chance? And hope to God that they will.
And the thing that is so incredibly, just astoundingly repulsive about that is that, as you said, it has nothing to do with conviction even. I mean, first of all, we talk, like what Prim talked about, how, you know, in these, if we had a different prison system where people got job training and they were set up with things that they could do productively in society after they were released from these, from their incarceration period, that would be one thing. But we're talking about people now who haven't even been convicted of crimes.
Oh, no. In some cases, we're talking about people who haven't even been charged with crimes. They've been arrested on suspicion, right? And that is part of their criminal record that is accessible in some states through a background check. So, yeah, no. And so essentially, you know, and then we have, again, the media narrative saying women never lie about these things. And so if there's smoke, there's fire. He got away with it. Infographic from whatever the fuck that. Yeah. And you know, those 4 men up there, you know, or 3 men way up there who were actually convicted out of the 1,000 men or whatever that they're claiming, right? None of them were falsely convicted, right? And all of those men who were not proven to have been falsely accused to a criminal court standard, right? All of those cases go back into the big bucket of rapes that actually happened, right?
Right, exactly. When they look at the statistics, which as someone who
based on no methodology whatsoever, they will nitpick canon, you know, and he used polygraphs. That's, you know, like that's a shoddy methodology. Well, what's the methodology you're using to throw all of those cases where there has been no determination made whatsoever back into the big bucket of rapes that actually happened? Oh, your methodology is women don't lie about rape.
Right.
It's a sacrifice they're willing to make.
There
Karen.
it is. We've come full circle. Oh God, that statistical stuff really, gets under my skin, because it's essentially, yeah, you've said, okay, well, is it X or Y? Did they do it, and were they found guilty in a court of law or not? So yes or no. And the answer for 95% of these cases is it's neither one. It's that, well, in that case, it is no, they were not found guilty. They were just, arrested or something. Something happened, but they were not found guilty in any way. They weren't convicted. They were nothing of a serious legal matter even happened. But when they do the statistical analysis, they just say, well, how about we include it as a maybe and thereby just say yes?
Yeah, no, it's like literally we don't know one way or another, so we're just going to say it actually happened exactly the way the complainant said, right? And it's
methods,
and it's like, you used a polygraph. Well, polygraphs aren't, and sometimes when you threaten someone with a polygraph, and sometimes people fail polygraphs and they're not like 100%. That's why they're not admissible in court. Yeah, but statistically, over a large sample, you could probably correct for the degree of error there, right?
Yeah, you can. Part of the problem is, there are so many different issues with polygraph tests. One being that people psych themselves up for them and can fail them, and that kind of stuff happens. Now, what you end up using,
sociopaths can pass them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what you end up needing to do is you include it in the wealth of your information provided.
That's right.
You can't really account, but you can say like, hey, look, we can have some additional data, because otherwise, what are we talking about? We're talking about he said, she said, completely unprovable claims in the vast majority of these cases. So there's not, if there's no DNA evidence, there's no physical evidence, what are we supposed to do?
Well, even if there's here's the thing, right? And here's the fucking thing, right? That there is this big complaint going on among feminists about the untested rape kits. Okay. Now, a few years, I forget exactly when it was, feminists lobbied and got it put in the law, because it used to be when you went in and you reported that you were a victim of a felony, right? I was raped, right? The police were called automatically, right? And you got your rape kit done at the hospital, and the hospital would call police. Now, the hospital can only call police if you want them to call. So you can get a rape kit done and never press charges, never make a report to police. And that's one of those untested rape kits that they're complaining about. Oh, these rape kits that are sitting around untested, right? And among the other rape kits that are sitting around untested are rape kits pertaining to cases where there is no disagreement between the parties as to whether the sex happened. The disagreement is over consent. So if the only thing in the rape kit is DNA evidence, you don't need it. He admitted he had sex with her. He's conceded that, right?
Yeah.
And the question is of consent. And there's nothing in the report, because this is an untested rape kit. An untested rape kit is the DNA evidence, right? The forensic evidence has not been put to it. It hasn't gone to a lab.
I'm going to shorten this, Karen.
But you
Karen,
still have the report from the doctor
tonight.
saying. Okay, but you still have the report from the doctor
Karen,
saying there were no injuries.
So I'm going to shorten this. So what you're basically pointing out is that there are rape kits.
Everyone's saying rape kits tonight.
Well, yeah, it's a Freudian slip, But no, you're pointing out that there are rape kits that the reason that they don't get tested is that there is not a benefit to the case to test the kit. That is an excellent thing to point out, and there is a very simple solution to this. And I put it forth to a woman on Twitter who was like going off about this, and she spent a couple of minutes looking for an angle to criticize it from, and she couldn't find one. And it just pissed her the fuck off for a minute, and then she followed me, which was funny. She later unfollowed me because I'm not a feminist. But the simple solution to this is you look at the law covering rape kits, you reform it so that 3 groups can demand a rape kit get processed, and it must be done if one of those 3 groups makes that demand. One being the victim, one being the accuser, I should say, and one being the accused, his side of the case, and one being the prosecutor. And if none of those make that demand, the kit does not have to get tested. If the results of the kit create demonstrate guilt, then the perpetrator has to pay for the test. It's part of his fines. If the results of the test demonstrably prove innocence, and it's proved that the accuser lied, then the accuser has to pay for the test. And if the prosecution demanded the test, and then the state covers it. Again, unless there was proof of guilt, in which case then I would say that the guilty party should have to pay for that. And that should go for male or female perpetrators. So that's the solution to this. That is all that needs to be said about it, because we're going to have to move on, because it's 9:46. And I know it's frustrating that feminists make a big deal about this when the way that they approach it is the least productive way to approach it. I think what we need to start doing is advocating for that specific reform that I just described. And every time you see a feminist bring it up, advocate for that specific reform, because they aren't going to be able to argue that there's anything wrong with it. If the accuser has complete control, and to where they can say, yes, I want this done, and it has to be done because they said they want it done. And if the accuser doesn't have to pay unless it's proved conclusively that she lied, and someone else requested that the test getting done wouldn't force her to pay unless it's proved conclusively that she lied, they're not going to have an argument that is going to be rational and persuasive to anybody as to why that reform shouldn't be enacted. But I'm going to move on and read the rest of the super chats, because I like I said, I have to leave tonight, and we still have an after show to do, and it is 9:45, so we only have a few minutes left. Actually, it's 9:48 now, so we only have a few minutes left before I'm going to have to call it a night for the show and call it to be continued, because there is definitely more to discuss on this. Panic by Numbers gave us $5 and said, could HBR be considered an extension of a caregiver instinct? I think in so much as firefighting can be considered an extension of a caregiver instinct. And not to say that we go through the same risks as firefighters, but we see an emergency situation. And because of that emergency situation, we've stepped forward and we do what we do because that emergency has to be dealt with, and that's basically it. It's not that we don't do it out of care for society and for men and for our families and for women, but the nature of the situation is people in the movement in general, men and women, have always stepped up because this is a societal emergency. Zasu July gave us $5 and says, it comes across that feminists want freedom from the consequence of their choices. And that's exactly what they want. They want freedom from consequence. They want freedom from accountability. They don't want equal accountability, and they never fight for equal accountability. They always fight for equal privileges, equal benefits, equal outcomes, equal positive outcomes, I should say. But you never see them fight for equal negative outcomes, equal harsh treatment, equal responsibility, equal accountability, equal culpability. So, yeah, feminism is essentially about keeping women entitled. Joey Jojo gives us $5 and says, so it's just a way to keep men in prison and women on welfare. It's a way to keep men weak and women entitled. I would argue that this makes both sexes weak in some ways. Being on welfare should never be considered a strength. It's basically a crutch, and the system will break your legs to continue keeping you on that crutch. And it'll break your legs every time it looks like you're getting ready to put that crutch down. And if you want to get off of welfare, you have to learn to walk on wounded legs until you heal them yourself. That's a hard thing to do. So But it is a way to exploit all of society. My dad calls it a plantation. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
government being the plantation owner and the citizen being the slave. And I think he's right.
Well, but I mean, like, it's essentially, it sounds like a sweet deal to the person on the receiving end, because all that's being asked of you, you're not being asked to toil in a cotton field. You're just being asked to vote, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's a
Oh,
soft form
and
of slavery, I guess,
you
but
know,
it's still slavery, I would say.
yeah,
I mean,
live in poverty.
you have agency. You're still agentic, but
Hmm.
it's a good analogy.
It's like being addicted, actually. It'd be like if they used drugs to keep people in the cotton fields instead of whips.
welfare is the opiate of the masses.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, it really is like an addiction. And it really is pushed the same way an addiction is pushed, both through persuasive means and fear. And I just like it's having been in that system myself, not to the degree that single moms end up where everything is paid for, but I've had insurance through it, and for short periods of time I've had food stamps through it, and they work their hardest to intimidate you out of leaving. It is unreal when you go in there, especially if you're female. In fact, I was advised to divorce my husband so that I could continue receiving benefits. It's
That's
that bad
disgusting.
and that blatant.
That's so weird. Like,
Yeah.
that's the opposite of my experience here in Canada, because I was on welfare for about 6 weeks, and well, we were briefly on welfare for about 3 weeks. My ex and I, just after my daughter was born, um, and it was because his unemployment checks were being garnished to the tune of 80% by his ex-wife to pay child support that he actually didn't owe. But because somebody at the child support agency office was dyslexic and kept getting the file numbers garbled, which was really infuriating. So we had this new baby, and it's Christmas, and his unemployment insurance check is 20% of what it would have been, and that's what we get to live on for a month. $270 some over the course of over the course of 2 weeks, right? With 4 people and 2 extras on the way, because the boys are coming, the stepsons are coming to visit, right? And so we went to the welfare office, and the woman there got us everything we were entitled to, including we were entitled to, because we had a new baby, entitled to all kinds of other things like money for a crib and money. We already had a crib, but the woman was very helpful. She got us. She was just like, "You've just fucking had some shit luck. Here, let me get you everything I can get for you, right? Because I know you're not going to be back here." And same when I went in and I got my, I went off work on medical leave, and my unemployment insurance for medical leave was not enough to cover, even like, it was way less than welfare, because none of my tips counted as actual earnings in the system, right? So they were not insured. So essentially, I went from 3/4 of my earnings being tips to earning 2/3 of the 1/4 of my earnings that was wage. So they gave me a welfare top up for 6 weeks, and they were super helpful too, because they looked at my record. I've been self-supporting for 20 years or more, and like, I'm desperate to just get out of the situation that I'm in so that I can get back into a job, right? And so they were like super, super helpful. And they actually looked at the people who time their babies perfectly every 3 years. So they're in there in the office to pick up their check, and they have like a baby in the stroller that's a couple months old, and then they have a 3-year-old, and they have a 6-year-old, and then they have a 9-year-old with them, right? Because they planned out those babies. Because when your kid hits 3 years old, you have to start looking for work. Otherwise, you can't stay on welfare, right? So they just have another baby. And they were not very helpful with those people. They were not very enthusiastic about those people.
Yeah, it's just it's the opposite here.
Yeah,
And
it must be. It's
well,
it's a very strange difference.
I'll tell you how bad it was. The one time I went in there, I sat and was sitting in the little waiting area, and it's cubicle hell in there, right? It's like this cubicle maze that has no end. So I'm sitting in this cubicle waiting area, and I look, and on the cubicle wall across from the chair I'm sitting in is this spread from the Dayton Daily News about how people who have successfully worked their way out of the welfare system are now starving, but they can't get welfare because they make too much money. Like they put that up all over the wall. Then
That's fucked up.
yeah,
You know, and there
it
are
was like,
things about
if you do
there are things
better,
about
this is what's going to happen to you.
there are
I was
things
just shocked.
Yeah, no, there are things about the system here that I don't like. I don't like that for every dollar you earn, that dollar comes off your welfare check, right? Because it
Right.
costs money to work. It costs money to get there and back. It costs money to buy clothes that you need to work. It costs money to work, right? And so essentially they deduct every single dollar you earn, or every single dollar you're paid in child support off of your welfare check. And you only earn. So unless you can actually transition into a job that is substantially better than welfare, right?
Yeah.
To accommodate your childcare costs and your travel costs and your wardrobe and all of the things that you need to actually the financial outlay of being able to go to work, right? Unless you can do that and then actually come out better, whether that's financially better or whether that's breaking even and just having the pride of being self-sufficient, unless you can do that, right, there's no incentive to actually go
Yeah.
off welfare.
Yeah,
And
see, that's what we
the
did.
case
We
here.
had
Yeah.
that situation where it's like a cliff. You have to or a canyon that you had to jump across. Here is how far welfare will take you. You're at this earnings level, and if you earn $1 more than this earnings level, they take away everything, or they knock you down another tier in what you're receiving, and it's a significant difference. You know, enough that it's a lot more than what you have gained, what your improvement is. And so you end up you're looking at this gap between what you have to earn in order to be able to pay all of your bills, and what you're allowed to earn and still receive these so-called benefits. And it's significant enough that you have to take on another part-time job, or you have to get a significant promotion, not like going from cashier to shift leader at a gas station, but actually becoming something like an assistant manager, or going to work at a better job, or graduating college and with a degree and becoming a nurse when you were a nurse's age, or something like that. And that traps a lot of people as well. But we could talk about this all night, and this would actually be a good topic for another show, because the situation really damages people's not just ability but incentive to try to get out of the welfare system.
Yeah.
But in any case, I'm going to go on with the rest of the super chats. Joey Jojo gave us $2 and asked if the Badgers are afraid of being replaced by robots. I would be terrified of a robot that was made to replace me.
Oh, I'm
Especially if it was programmed. Like, don't program any part of my early adulthood into it, or it'll kill everybody.
I want to ask Joey Jojo, what makes you think that we're not actually robots?
Oh, I get accused by feminists all the time of being a bot, so that's actually a good question.
X-Files music.
Yes, or Twilight Zone music. You never know. Lloyd Franklin gives us £5 and says, "Stop saying right, Karen. I can't drink any more shots. I can barely stand up now." Oh,
right.
Lloyd, it sounds like you're a victim of your own choices. So we have...
You chose to play that drinking game, you fucker. Right?
Yep. Then we have 2 from Xeranx. Xeranx gave us $5 and says, "Probably the last stream of the year, so here you go. Thanks, Badgers." And I would like to thank Xeranx, who also gave us $20 and says, at Hannah, regarding encouragement to divorce for welfare, are people openly showing their contempt for families when they scoff at the family values tag of rep, despite rep track record, Republicans, I'm guessing, despite the Republican track record at encouraging said values? I think there's a degree to which they do, simply because you have there's been some hypocrisy among some serious hypocrisy among the politicians who are doing it, and that's not to say leadership necessarily, but specific politicians have been really bad about that. And then there's also been some issues of they have a positive idea, but the execution is bad. Like when they included in the welfare reform law that they would pay the states to collect child support. The federal government would pay the states to collect child support from the dads that everybody labels deadbeats, without taking any consideration, offering any consideration for the fact that a significant portion of those dads are booted out of their homes by the wife, are kept from being close to their children, are victims of a court system that uses imputed income to create draconian child support obligations that they cannot meet, and who essentially are put in a situation where they're programmed, the situation they're in is programmed for them to fail. And what that ended up doing was incentivizing the states to take control of divorce agreements in a way that they had not controlled them before. And now we have this epidemic of men unable to pay their child support, and their lack of ability to pay their child support is criminalized. And there's a whole new class of debtors prisons around it.
Yeah.
So
and I want to also
this is not to say that Republicans are not the family values party, but that execution of that value is really dysfunctional and really counterproductive.
And what's the most frustrating about it is, like, Dave Foley, who was the lead actor on the show News Radio with Phil Hartman before he was killed by his wife. He would be considered under the law in Canada to be a deadbeat dad, right? Because his child support and alimony were assigned when that show was essentially in the top 5 sitcoms on TV, on network TV. And she divorced him at that point, and that's the level at which it was set. So it doesn't matter. He can pay $8,000 in a month, $12,000, $21,000 in a month, but his alimony and child support, if I recall, is set at $28,000 per month. And the fact that he cannot pay it in full every month means he is, under Canadian law, a deadbeat, and he was unable to actually set foot on Canadian soil for years, because he would have been immediately arrested and incarcerated indefinitely until he came up with the over $500,000 he owed her in back child support, because the show was canceled, and he's not earning as much as he was when he was the lead actor in a hit show. But he could, so he must, right? He has before, so he must, and that's the Ontario system, right? The different provinces have different systems. British Columbia would never actually do that, because they would be like, yeah, his circumstances have changed, and so we're gonna scale this down, because if you're still married to the woman and still living with her, her income, her standard of living would have suffered a hit if they were still married. But yeah, and she would have to show that he was intentionally avoiding earning money. But yeah, Ontario is still lagging behind, and lots of states are still lagging behind. And the federal government in the U.S. Gives them dollar for dollar kickbacks.
Yes, this is where legal reform needs to take the form of recognizing the individual's autonomy. Divorces are shit. I will say that. It's a horrible thing for a family to go through. It's horrible for both sexes. It's horrible for the children. It's horrible for the extended family, and it's horrible for the friends. But the people involved in the divorce are responsible for the divorce. They are getting divorced because they failed at their relationship. And it may be that one side failed more than the other, but it should be first and foremost on the divorcing couple to make an agreement and live by it. And I think if the state stepped back and only got involved when there were extenuating circumstances that made it impossible or extremely unfair in terms of bargaining power, so that the divorcing couple would not be able to come to an agreement and live by that agreement. I think that the state should just step back and let men and women who are getting divorced decide for themselves. Like the default could be if they don't make a different decision and they say, we want to go with the state's default, 50-50 shared parenting, no setup for child support. That if they want there to be a setup for child support, they got to come up with it themselves. And I honestly think that would be the best route to go. And that would solve quite a bit of problems.
It would certainly change the incentives and the disincentives involved.
Yeah, and I don't think that the federal government should be paying the states to collect child support. I think that should be on the states.
Oh,
if
God,
they're going to collect child support. This is something that a divorce is just like a marriage. It's a contract. You are creating a contract. You sign that contract. Anything that you deviate from that contract on should be considered breach of contract. That's it. All this criminalizing of failure to live up to a divorce and the state deciding what your contract is going to be, it's just all it has done is create a higher degree of damage in divorces. And I don't know how soon we would be able to get society to adopt that type of reform, but it would definitely be a wise thing for the movement to advocate for. I'm going to read the last two super chats. Here we have Hopsh27 gave us $2 and said, "Thank you, ladies, for what you do." And I wanted to say thanks back. Thanks all of you for listening to us, because without our listeners and without our patrons, we wouldn't be able to do this. Xeranx gave us $5 and said, "Is there any way to raise constitutionality arguments regarding divorce and or alimony and child support?"
Yes, there are. There absolutely are on a bunch of different levels and grounds. There are constitutional issues regarding that. But what there are humans involved in the system, and in order to actually get something to get up to the Supreme Court,
just had to get in there.
You actually have to have, there has to be a political will. There has to be a public, there has to be some kind of public, some indication that the public wants this, right? And because
well,
honestly,
there would have to be a person to file a lawsuit. There would have to be a plaintiff for the attorneys to represent. There would have to be funding for the lawsuit, and that's where it would have to be matter to the public. But the Supreme Court doesn't make its decisions based on what the public wants. It makes its decisions based on the Constitution.
Based on law. Yeah,
so,
and
based
law
on
and the Constitution. But essentially, the Supreme Court can say, essentially, fuck off, dismissed.
Yeah,
right?
they can decide not to hear a case. They can decide that it's not important enough to hear. So, I mean, that's probably not going to be, that route is probably not going to be an effective route for getting this through. This is going to actually take social change. It's going to have to be based on raising public understanding of female accountability, raising public understanding of the importance of having both parents involved in a child's life, raising public understanding and awareness of the fact that money doesn't replace parenting, and then advocating for reform of existing divorce laws. That's
Well,
hard,
yeah,
but it's what's
yeah.
going to have to happen.
It is,
And
but I mean, like like, okay, but when you say the Supreme Court can consider a case not important enough
yeah,
to actually adjudicate, right? But if there was an outcry from the public, right, then the Supreme Court would have a harder time arguing that it's just not important enough, right?
Now that public outcry, that type of public outcry, if we raised that degree of public outcry, what we would end up with is enough of a movement to simply get the law reformed. And I think it would probably, either way, it would be a better route. Getting the law reformed, either way, would be a better route. And with that, I'm going to call the show a to be continued, because there is definitely more to discuss on this situation. I want to next episode, what I'm probably going to do is go through and reiterate some of the questions I asked at the end of the opening for this show, and because there are some things that we probably ought to address in those questions. And with that, I'll go on. Here at Honey Badger Radio, we have been found guilty of wrongthink. And as such, we are on the wrong side of YouTube. If you don't want to wake up one morning and find yourself unable to find our content because our channels have been incarcerated, go to badgerfeed.com. Also, we've moved to a digest format for podcasting. So for those who are listening to this in an audio format, if you want to follow our uncut live streams, you'll be able to find those at badgerfeed.com. So everybody just go to badgerfeed.com, man. It's where the cool kids are. And once again, to all of the cool kids listening tonight, to my co-hosts, and to everyone who helps make Honey Badger live streams happen, thank you and good night.